The Memory of Love, Chapter 7. A morning, Adrian sits on the window ledge and surveys the patch of land between the back of the bungalow and the perimeter wall. On a length of surgical thread, a plastic prescription bottle filled with sugar solution and fashioned into makeshift bird feeder is suspended from a vine. Adrian finishes his cup of coffee, pours the dregs down the drain, and goes to shower and shave. When he returns, a tiny sunbird, no bigger than a rosebud, is hovering next to the bird feeder, its wings held high above its back. Beat so fast, the bird is reduced to no more than a smudge of color and a long curved beak. Hastily, Adrian picks up his sketch pad and block of watercolors and tries to capture the blur of violet and black feathers. He should, he knows, be on his way to his office. Instead, he draws and watches the bird, weightless in the air, as if held by an invisible filament, and he considers how slender, how insubstantial his reasons for being here. As a boy, he had imagined his adult life as one of countless adventures. Early versions of the same vision saw him involved in the rescue of animals, a drowning dog, a horse with a broken leg. As his imagination roamed farther from home, he saved wild animals from forest fires or even from extinction. Later, the animals were replaced by a girl or a woman, his cousin Madeline or his dark-haired art teacher. At night, he dreamt of his art teacher, of acts of heroism, and of great journeys undertaken of hate scale, all with a kind of remote, fuzzy certainty. How exactly these adventures would contribute was unclear. They simply lay ahead of him somewhere in a distant amber-colored future. When he came to thinking about it much later, he saw the tint of his boyhood dreams had not been so much amber and sepia. Memories of his grandfather and grandmother, perhaps of their faintly exotic ways, the ivory cigarette lighter and camphor-scented cigarette boxes, the polished wooden floors and rugs, long before such furnishings became fashionable. Of his mother, who was so nearly born abroad, it used to impress him. How close she came to being foreign as he thought of it. His pregnant grandmother stepping off the boat home in the run-up to war. His boyhood adventures took place not in the future, but in some fictional landscape of the past that could equally have been prompted by Tintin, Ryder Haggard, or any of the adventure books boys his age consumed. Adventures undertaken and survived, which would somehow solve all the things that had been puzzling him, and after which a quieter life began. Sometime around Adrian's 15th year, the imaginings faded, to be replaced by an anxiety creeping and insidious. Life inside the house slowed and became suffused with a muted quality as his father's illness progressed. Adrian's mother's hopes gathered like clouds above her son's head. University followed exams. Adrian chose to study close to home to be on hand to help his mother. By the time he began his second year, those of his friends who had taken a year out returned properly and newly confident, only to depart again to take up their place in university towns far from home. When he left for Bristol to pursue his clinical training, he did so alone, in the knowledge of the post he had been offered and had declined at the hospital in a nearby town. At the railway station, he turned and watched his mother's cloth coat disappear into the crowd, back to the closed walls of life with his father, his mother, who was nearly born in a foreign land. The bird has been hovering for what seemed to Adrian a remarkable length of time. With his brush, he applies the paint straight onto the paper, sheet after sheet covered in images of the bird. Somebody, Adrian forgets, who once told him that if humans were to fly, they would require chest muscles 6 feet deep to raise their own height. He wonders now if this could possibly be right, or if it is one of those beliefs of which there are so many small and large, carried from childhood to adulthood without question. He didn't know the birds expanded such energy in flight. They needed to drink twice their body weight in nectar each day. Such effort invested in the mere fact of existence. Sometimes nature's ways did not bear scrutiny, only the results, a beauty that burst the banks of logic. 9 o'clock. He swirls his brush into the water. Onto his palette, daubs the paper. At the end of the corridor, his office awaits. Adrian paints on. The bird's feathers, now in full sun, appear black, though they are in fact the deepest purple with a metallic sheen he knows he lacks the expertise to capture. Once his life was guided by train timetables, 50-minute appointments that ended regardless of whether the timing was good or bad for his client. They were clients now, patients no longer. An hour for lunch, usually curtailed by staff matters. 2 trains home, 20 minutes and 7 minutes, respectively. Perhaps an evening engagement, the hours in which hospitality will be dispensed, neatly printed out in the black and white, and posted 6 weeks in advance. None of that here. In the moments before his arrival, in those same hazy visions of his youth, he had imagined lines of patients not clients, and in responding to his patients' needs, his workload would create itself and he would end each day gratifyingly exhausted. So he had thought. But they had stopped coming now, more or less entirely, and he suspects his colleagues have stopped bothering to make referrals. These are the thoughts that swirled in the back of his mind, like the colors of the paint in the water. He came here to help, and he is not helping. He is not helping. He glanced at the clock on the wall above the shelf. Standing at the end of the uneven row of paperbacks is a neat group of thicker volumes, Surviving Trauma, the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Handbook, the World Health Organization's Mental Health of Refugees, ICD-10, Classification of Mental and Behavioral Disorders, Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of Mental Disorders. He begins to mix crimson paint and water, adds quantities of Prussian blue. During his clinical years, Adrian had found himself drawn to the study of stress disorders. As a boy of 12, around the same time as his adventurous imaginings began, he'd gone through a phase of reading books about the First World War. The stories he read and reread with morbid fascination were those of shell-shocked soldiers being forced back to face the guns or else being shot for cowardice. Once he'd recounted some of those stories for his mother. He remembered it distinctly. She standing making butterscotch pudding at the kitchen counter. In turn, she had recounted her own memories of the Second World War. Once Adrian's mother told him, when her mother was out and she was being minded by a neighbor, the air raid sirens had sounded. The neighbor, a woman in her 40s, already yellowed with age and capstan cigarettes, led her to the air raid shelter. His mother remembered sitting huddled next to her neighbor upon the cold floor of the shelter, feeling the cold replaced a floor of warmth, thinking she had wet herself until she realized the urine belonged not to her, but to the neighbor. The pool of liquid slowly turned chill. Sitting in the warm kitchen, Adrian could smell the acrid tang of urine, the brick dust and stale air. Later, Adrian read how teams of psychiatrists had accompanied the men to the front during the Second World War, but none for the civilians back home. He thought nobody provided psychiatry for them. In the last month of Adrian's third year of clinical studies, A gas leak on an oil rig 120 miles off the coast of Aberdeen caused an explosion late one night. The force of the explosion wrenched the platform in two. A torrent of flame rushed upwards into the northern skies. The men trapped on the rig escaped the flames by sliding down the support poles or jumping hundreds of feet into freezing seas overlaid with a slick of burning oil. 160 men died. The survivors, who were few in number, struggled to return to their lives. They visited their doctors, complaining of nightmares and flashbacks of sleeplessness, panic attacks of moods that swung from fear to fury. Several took to drinks. One would not be touched by water, stopped washing, and hid in his house behind locked doors. Another saw his wife and children wearing the faces of his dead colleagues. A third soiled himself at the sight of the sea. Adrian wrote a paper arguing for a more proactive response from mental health professionals after major disasters and had it accepted for publication. At the time, many among his colleagues still described traumatized patients as suffering from nervous shock. The paper won Adrian modest acclaim when it was cited by lawyers preparing a case for compensation against the rig's owners. What previously had not existed as a classified mental disease 8 years earlier suddenly drew the attention of others in his field. Adrian knew he should feel pleased. Instead, he felt cold and anxious, as though he had foolishly revealed the whereabouts of something precious. The years ticked by. Adrian built up a steady private practice alongside his position as a senior clinical psychologist at a London hospital. His mother's regard, he had outdone himself. Adrian, though, felt his career oscillated just short of its tipping point. Meanwhile, there were new developments: stress inoculation, rewind technique. A practitioner of neurolinguistic programming made his name with the publication of a theory he named emotional freedom technique. In America, a woman psychologist developed a method called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Some among the fraternity dismissed it as quackery, though Adrian wondered if this wasn't, at least in part, because the originator of the technique was both a woman and based in California. Adrian read all the available writings, including those of the dissenters. The results as published were dramatic, and nobody, not even the psychologist herself, whose name was Francine Shapiro, could entirely account for them. Out of sight of his colleagues, Adrian attended a training course and on occasion had even practiced the technique upon his private clients. Yet, despite investing every effort in keeping abreast of new developments, as his chosen field grew ever more populated, increasingly it felt to Adrian that the momentum of his career had dissipated. So when he saw the advertisement in the back of a professional journal for a government-sponsored psychologist to work overseas, Adrian had mailed an application to the address of the International Health Agency the same afternoon. He hadn't mentioned it to Lisa. The post was for a 6-week project. In the event his application failed, and he'd not bothered Lisa with news of that either. Then, one Friday night, a voice faintly on the telephone from Rome. The successful applicant had been taken in. Was Adrian free to go at short notice? Why there? Lisa had asked him. When he finally told her, she'd seemed neither pleased nor displeased, simply baffled. A civil war had placed the country in the news in the last year or so. Several times in their conversation, Lisa transposed the name of the country to Sri Lanka, where a civil war was also being fought, though on an entirely different continent. The team had stuck together beneath a steel surface upon which people shopped at the market and went to work. Violence babbled, erupting from time to time in the rural areas. There was a curfew from 8 to 8. Nobody left the capital. Adrian enjoyed the camaraderie, the sensation of remote danger On his return to England, he had applied for a further posting and been accepted. When he told Lisa, he included in his account the impression his return had been requested. She had not been happy, and yet it could not be said she had been happy for several years. The second time the plane was crowded, groups of Europeans held conversations outside the toilets, in the aisles, across the backs of the seats. The Africans, for the most part, remained seated. Adrian knew nobody, though one or two among them ventured to ask his business, or more precisely, with which agency he was working. Adrian's brief amounted to not much more than the name of a hospital and the information they had requested, an in-house psychologist. The hospital administrator, a woman in her 40s, with hair pulled back into a knot from which it escaped at spiky angles, was new to her job and seemed unprepared for his arrival. Her brisk manner conveyed less regret at her own lack of readiness than a sense that his coming at this time was something of an inconvenience. Why? Lisa had asked him. Why this place? He had shrugged and told her there had been no choice, and that was partly the truth. The real truth was he'd always known this country's name, never made the mistake of confusing it with an island nation thousands of miles away. When for a few weeks, one year, the country was briefly in the news, he knew a little more about it than most. At the very least, he knew its correct location, Sierra Leone, the place where his mother had nearly been born. 9:35. He really must be gone. The bird is no longer feeding, but sitting at the apex of a curl of razor wire. Adrian carries the plate he has been using as a pilot to the sink, holds it under the tap, watches the colors as they run into each other. He leaves the plate upside down to dry on the draining board and goes around the flat, turning off lights. On his way out of the house, he takes down several of the reference books from the shelf, tucks them under his arm. He steps outside into the heat and light, closes the door carefully behind him, turns his key in the upside-down lock, and slips it into his pocket.